Cars is a very interesting franchise for channels like ours. Of course, it's not a series like Gravity Falls where there are hidden mysteries every 2 pixels, but it's such a strange and interesting world that we always come back to it. And for some inexplicable reason, there's always material we hadn't found for previous videos. That's why, in this pseudo-sequel to our previous videos exploring how this world works, we're back with 3 mysterious mysteries that we hadn't been able to cover in past years. And we'll explore even the darkest, most demonetizable parts of this motorized alternate universe's history. Mystery 1. Is Mater a cannibal? I don't know if you noticed from our previous videos, or if you've picked up on certain hints in the movies, but living in the Cars universe is a freaking nightmare. Or at least, that's what I think. The division between animals isn't clear. It really doesn't make sense how the infrastructure of society works, and even the religion itself seems to be a complete mess. And you might say it's weird, yeah, but that doesn't make it a nightmare, does it? Yeah, just give me a moment and I'll traumatize you. In the first movie, Mater lives in a junkyard, a place decorated with rims, exhaust pipes, a few chassis here and there, and well, you know, things that wouldn't look strange in a regular auto shop. But I mean, what would the job of a dismantler be? In this universe, the first thing I thought of was a doctor repairing damaged units. But it's not just that there are doctors in Cars, with Mater mentioning he was one, but the mechanics we see don't seem to handle things like that. Thinking about it, it seems more logical to assume that doctors check the biological aspects of the cars, while engineers take care of the mechanical aspects. But that still doesn't fully explain why someone would put pieces of corpses in their home. I mean, I don't know a single normal person with a kidney on their wall. This gets much darker when we consider that Mater is a tow truck, a type of car specifically created to help tow cars in danger, who works in a place as arid, inhospitable, and rarely visited as Radiator Springs has been in recent years. Thinking about it that way, it's particularly disturbing. In fact, when Mater meets Lightning, he gets really startled by his presence, asking not to be hurt and begging to be let go. Now, the idea of the scene is to show his irrational fears and that he's trapped, but from the perspective of a car surrounded by tires, pipes, and mufflers, pieces of the corpses of other poor souls whose bodies ended up in that maniac's warehouse. Well, I can understand the panic with which Lightning McQueen reacted. Everything gets much more complicated when we consider the fact that they use these parts inside themselves or other cars. So it could be a form of cannibalism or rather ultra disturbing body modification, at least for us. We can think of it this way because all the parts that are kept are from the mechanical part of the organism, completely ignoring the biological side. And yes, this is possibly much less taboo than it is in our society, but even if you believe in that, it doesn't change the fact that the loneliest, most ignored and marginalized person in town lives among car wrecks, with which people usually don't want to be associated. I can't stop thinking about a guy with a kidney on the wall. Mystery 2. Who caused 9/11 in Cars? Disclaimer: this segment analyzes how the fictional universe of Cars reflects real historical events for educational and entertainment purposes. As you can imagine, Pixar has never directly mentioned what happened to the Twin Towers in Cars, unlike, for example, James Gunn, who said that the event hadn't happened yet. But the thing is that the consequences of this event are extremely evident in that world, and quite noticeable. Going back to Cars 2 because this whole damn video is Cars 2's fault, the airport scene shows us that planes still have security gates and screenings, along with all those things that travelers know and really dread. These systems and controls are carried out by the TSA, part of the Transportation Security Administration. They're somewhat extreme measures that were added to prevent exactly another incident like September 11th from happening, so the current levels of airport security are a direct consequence of that attack. And not only that, in the story of Ciao America and airplanes, we can clearly see the skyline of New York City, where the Twin Towers are completely omitted, so in a subtle way, they show us that they must have fallen during the attack. So, we already agreed that it did happen, but now we need to bring up a rather strange idea. Were there people involved? What were they? Were they completely independent planes that, on their own, decided to carry out the attack? Or were they cars that hijacked the planes, conscious planes, before crashing them? Well, now that I think about it, because of all those security measures we see in Cars 2, the hijackers responsible for the attack must have existed, since these sensors are meant to detect any kind of tampering with the vehicles or weapons among the passengers. So everything points to it being a team of cars that hijacked one of the passenger planes. But those planes don't just have passengers, they're alive too. Which brings us to the million-dollar question. How did they convince a sentient plane to crash directly into a building? And we can rule out that it was an evil plane that was part of the plan because of the very existence of the TSA, since they would have other security measures aimed at the planes themselves and not at the cars. But then, what happened? If we look at the information we have available about the case in the real world, we'll find an interesting detail. The perpetrators lied to all the passengers, claiming that there was supposedly a bomb inside the plane, and swearing that they were only turning back to return to the airport where they would negotiate with the police, which kept people relatively calm until their tragic end. Unfortunately, this is not the only evidence confirming that the planes were deceived into carrying out these acts, because we can find another clue by looking at the buildings that still exist. Yes, this means we need to dive into a brief history lesson about the tragedy so we're all on the same page, and clarify the fact that the two planes that crashed into the Twin Towers were not the only ones hijacked. Officially, 4 aircraft are recognized, Flight 11 and Flight 175, which struck the North and South Towers respectively. We also have Flight 77, which crashed into the Pentagon, and finally, Flight 93, which is rumored to have been intended to hit the White House. But it crashed in a field in Shanksville after the passengers fought against the hijackers, managing to knock it off course. Considering that we know the White House is still intact in this world, we must take into account the fact that Flight 93 was also hijacked and crashed before reaching its destination. In the real world, the only reason that miraculous revolt happened was because Flight 93 was delayed by 42 minutes, which allowed all the passengers to find out about the impacts on the towers before taking off. So, most likely, in the world of Cars, when everyone found out about the attacks after the flight delay, it was the plane itself that decided to crash into the ground after discovering it had been hijacked, once again reflecting what tragically happened in our reality. So, unlike all the discussion we've seen online around these topics, it seems it wasn't the planes. There's more than enough evidence throughout the movies to prove that it was the cars who coerced and hijacked these planes. And by the way, they confirm the existence of elements like religious extremism, the Abrahamic religions, and the wars and conflicts that happened as a consequence of this horrible event. But we're not done yet. Mystery 3. The mustached fascist who must not be named existed, and I have proof. Disclaimer, once again, this is an analysis of how the Cars universe reflects one of the darkest periods in human history, so things are going to get a bit dark. The analysis is about the fictional world, not a glorification of any ideology. Yes, I know it's an excellent title, although very risky, and I'm already taking a big risk just with the previous mystery, but let me say it loud and clear. There's no way Carlo Hitler didn't exist in this world. Starting with the weakest connection of all this, we have the character of Professor Sundap, an evil scientist, clearly German from his accent to his name, who is obsessed with modifications, torture, experimental weapons, and so on. Believe it or not, this archetype of the evil German scientist character has a title, being known as Hard Doctor, a representation of evil doctor with those traits, which is heavily inspired by the criminal Mengele from the Nazi Party. But while to me this might sound like an interesting piece of evidence, to you it might just sound like a simple reference. So if that doesn't seem like solid enough evidence to you that, well, scientists like this existed in this world, we have at least 2 vehicles that were directly involved in an armed conflict before, which, although not mentioned by name, is obviously referring to World War II. These 2 vehicles are Sarge and Captain Skipper. In Sarge's case, everything is much clearer, since he's based on the Willys Army Jeeps, showing in flashbacks that he was a highly decorated and patriotic general. Now, while with him we have to deduce his participation in the war from what we just mentioned, it's precisely with Skipper Riley that we actually see real flashbacks of this war, based on a Vought F-4U Corsair, a plane used in World War II. In the real world, it is mentioned that it was used to patrol the Glendale Canal, along with a group of rookies, an area that, although it doesn't exist in our world, is a parody of Guadalcanal, a strategic point during the war. In fact, in this flashback we are also shown warships, which confirm that a war in this universe is fought with heavy artillery, bullets, oil, and death. And by the way, they imply that events like Pearl Harbor are even more disturbing. When you consider that the Japanese kamikaze planes were aiming to kill a living ship, splitting it in half while it drowned, an incredibly dark idea for a children's saga about little cars. This opens up the idea that, for example, the same plane that dropped the bombs on Japan could very well have post-traumatic stress disorder to this day because of its war crimes. And when we remember the use of trains for the genocidal purposes of Nazi Germany, well, everything suddenly gets very grim and dark. And we realize that this is a world full of blood, death, and destruction, with the Germans being led by a car with a funny bumper. Extra mystery and alternate reality. This is more of a mystery that I found interesting enough to cover, but it's so short that we'll consider it more of a curiosity, or something we'll later cut out to make a short. At the beginning of the movie, it's made very clear to us that Lightning McQueen is a rookie racer, daring, and unaware of all the dangers. He decides to avoid going into the pits to gain an advantage by refusing a tire change, which would ultimately end up costing him the race. That is the event that completely sets off the plot, which ends up placing him in Radiator Springs. And with that, the franchise we know begins. But what would have happened if he had decided to humble himself a bit and go in for the tire change? This is an old AT&T commercial from 2006, which shows a short interview with McQueen, reusing the opening scene from the movie, with clips, backgrounds, and even the pit crew that he loses after that particular race. So it seems like this is an alternate universe where McQueen did change his tires and didn't lose the race. Or, well, that's what I assume. It's a glimpse into a world where he never learns the lessons that life wants to teach him, but instead keeps those toxic attitudes. And, to be honest, I'm really curious to know how things turned out in this universe where Lightning McQueen's downfall never happened. Maybe the rest of his life as a racer would have been interesting. Or maybe he would have just died shortly after, a victim of the events of Cars 2, and without being saved by Mater and his friends since he never met them. Or maybe he had a great time because he subscribed to Lulia. We'll never know, so I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you did, subscribe for more videos like this and more mysterious mysteries, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.